All right, so I think about it. Suppose then I think and I say, well, I believe that Juliet is the sun means, and here's my first hypothesis, my first interpretive hypothesis. The text is my data. How do I put the right interpretive framework on this? I believe that Juliet is the sun means that Juliet is the male offspring of Mr. and Mrs. Capulet. That's what Romeo is saying. All right. That's a bad hypothesis. You're my teacher, and in your hopefully firm but gentle teacherly way, you want to explain to me why that's not really a very good hypothesis. How would you go about doing that in this particular case? Well, the first obvious thing you would no doubt focus on is the fact that I probably misread the word S-U-N, Juliet is the sun, as S-O-N. So one thing you might then do is say, Stephen, you need to observe a little more carefully the letters on the page here. Notice that the last word is actually S-U-N, not S-O-N. Now the U and the O in some cases are close to each other. It does take some perceptual discrimination to distinguish those. But if you observe carefully, you will realize that it's very different concepts, sun, S-O-N versus sun, S-U-N. And that matters in this particular case. All right, so then I say, oh, yes, I now can observe that, but suppose I came back at you and said, well, I still think it means that Juliet is the male offspring of Mr. and Mrs. Capulet, and this is simply a typo, a typographical error in the text. It should be S-O-N. That's what's really going on here. Now, in that case, how would you come back to me and explain that that hypothesis still is not a good hypothesis? What kinds of evidence, what kind of data would you be able to point to? And in this case here, you should be able to point out things like, for example, that Juliet is referred to later in the passage with the pronoun her or she. And the she is the female pronoun, so if we're going to be consistent, if Juliet is referred to as a she can't be a male, and so she can't be the son, S-O-N, of Mr. and Mrs. Capulet. So the idea then is you are finding evidence in the text that bears against my hypothesis and refutes my hypothesis. It's evidence that I should be able to find in my text and verify for myself, and then go through the same logic to realize that my hypothesis is not very good here. We can also point out that Juliet is traditionally a girl's name, not a boy's name. We can investigate that. One of the possibilities might be that Juliet was a boy's name back in Shakespearean time. We do know that the genders of various names changes over time. So we could do a little etymological research here, get further evidence that would bear on the hypothesis. And in this case, what we would find is all of the data that we find bears against my hypothesis, and so the hypothesis then logically is refuted. It's not one that is consistent with all of the data here. All right, so then, fine. Suppose you as the teacher then come back to me and say, all right, so that was a nice try, but that one didn't work out. We still don't know what Shakespeare means by Juliet is the sun. What's another hypothesis that could be explanatory here? All right, suppose then I put my thinking cap back on and I say, all right, Romeo's a young man, Juliet is a young woman, he's in love with them, he's also a teenager with raging hormones, he probably thinks she's really sexy. So what Romeo means is, when he says she is the sun is hot, what Romeo is saying, wow, Juliet, you're really hot, or Juliet is really hot. And I'm a 21st century student in your class, and so we know that hot in this case is slang for saying that someone is sexy. So what Romeo is saying then literally is that Juliet is sexy to him, and he's using this sun metaphor as a metaphor for sexy. All right, now, again, hopefully right as the teacher you would say, nice try, and in fact that is a nicer try. I'm in this case getting into the metaphorical swing of things and understanding that it's a metaphorical passage. And I've come up with a hypothesis that does put at least a plausible from interpretation on that metaphor from the perspective of a 21st century kid in your class. But still, if we're trying to interpret Shakespearean literature or Shakespeare as the author of this is not a legitimate or good hypothesis in this particular case. Question then would be, how would you as a teacher show to me that in fact that hypothesis is not the best hypothesis and probably not what Shakespeare means in this particular case? This is a little bit more challenging here. One thing, of course, that you could do is to say, well, you are using the word hot in the 21st century colloquial sense of sexy, and that's not how Shakespeare used that word ever in his corpus, in his language. Now, I as a student would say, all right, fine, chances are good that you as the teacher know more about these things than I do, but suppose I challenged you on that. How would you demonstrate to me that, in fact, Shakespeare never did use the term hot in that particular way? And we might have to go to a Shakespearean concordance that lists all of the words that Shakespeare uses in all of the places in his corpus and all of the shades of meaning. So we go to the entry that says hot, and here's the way that Shakespeare used the word hot at various points. And we never find that he used it in the sense of being sexy, and so that would then be evidence that counts against my hypothesis. And then perhaps there are other things that we could do. All right, suppose then you put it back to me. Again, I've agreed with you that my second hypothesis really isn't that good a hypothesis. So we try again. Suppose I think about it and I say, all right, here's my new hypothesis. And actually this one I am fairly proud of. I made it up myself. I made up the other two, but those are just to make an educational point here. So I, as your student, come up with this hypothesis. Well, the sun is a strong source of light, and light makes possible life, color, and warmth. So what Romeo is saying by calling her the sun is that she inspires in him the emotional correlates of life, color, and warmth. Right? So the sun is a metaphor then for the emotional life that she brings to him, the color that she brings to his life, and the warmth. Right? Certainly there would be an erotic component to that. He feels heated up, right, so to speak, in her presence.